Since there's instability, last Thursday, the African Union took the decision of suspending Sudan as a member until everything has been pacified. The Organization of Peace informed through their Twitter account that this country could not participate of any activity of the organization. And they think it's the only way to get Sudan out of the crisis. The Council also decides that if the power is not given to a transition power, they will have some punishment to the entities and the people who obstaculize. This is the decision of the Council. The decision of the African Union, as we heard, is produced after security forces took opposers out of the streets, and they did it by force. They were asking for the military authorities to leave. The militaries not only agreed to suspend everything that had agreed, but they only acknowledged 46 dead. However, the medical authorities say that it's more than double, 120. The United Nations say that they're alarmed for such an attack on civilian people. Let's hear some declarations. I can say with not much positivism that the conversations with both sides are being advanced. There has been a committee formed to form mediation, and they're also going to work with European Union, Troika, and United Nations. We have agreed that any agreement should be done by a different side. We do not trust the military council. This is what experience has taught us. There are many promises that have not been fulfilled, and the time has been delayed. We're saying that any agreement should be only one that takes us to a civil government with no other discussion. Now, how we always do it, let's locate Sudan. It's officially the Republic of Sudan. It's in the African continent. So it's one of the 50 countries of Africa. The capital is Khartoum. It's bordered by Egypt to the north, Red Sea to the northeast, Eritrea to the east, Ethiopia to the southeast, South Sudan to the south, Central African Republic to the southwest, to be specific, Chad to the west, and Libya to the northwest. Let's see. It was the largest country in just before, but now it's the third one after the division. It's more than 40 million people live in this territory, and they live from different ethnias. That is the product of all of the mixtures that there has been. So it's basically Arab people, and the Islam is the religion. Many ethnias, many cultural groups. Let's go add more information about the relevance of geopolitical of Sudan, because due to the resources and their geostrategic location, it's a key location, it's a key piece in Africa, and many powers dispute their territory. This is why there's such instability.
Sudan.
Sudan. Their importance is that it's an African country rich in oil, gold, zinc, and gas. Although it's a poor country due to the inequality, after the separation, it has a rapid growth economy, and that has had this is due to the rapid growth of exportation. More than 80% of hydrocarbon is in the south, but most ports are on the north. Sudan sends its raw material to Asia, China, Japan, and India. In the Gulf, additionally to hydrocarbons and minerals, the waters of the Nile go to their coasts. This river is the second biggest after Africa, and it flows through 10 countries. The history goes back to history. It belonged to Egypt until 1899, and then it became part of Great Britain. Then in 1956, it became independent, and a little over 50 years, it's been affected by 2 civil wars between the North and the South. The first war began in 1955, and it went to 1972. And it was because the south part wanted to be autonomous. After 70 years and 500,000 people dead, there was an agreement of Addis Ababa that put into that war. However, the negotiation was not successful, and there was a second civil war between 1983 and 2005. It was one of the longest and deadliest war in the world, and at least 1 million people dead. It ended in 1995 with another peace agreement, and the definitive political peace came in 2011 with the proclamation of independence of Sudan of the South. The North became Arab. Sudan is part of many organisms like United Nations, League of the Arab Nations, African Union, Islamic Cooperation Organization, and it's also an observer of the Organization of World Commerce. Let's go to some information of the press in Latinoamericana Press. Yesterday there was an article of that dialogues would restart to establish institutional order in Sudan. What we see it is that we're seeing it on screen. The military council with the opposition, they agreed to reinstate the dialogues to find a solution, a peaceful solution, after several meetings with special authorities of Ethiopia. The meetings took place in Khartoum. It was agreed that both parts would stop any aggressions. For example, the Council would liberate any political prisoners, and the opposition would not do any more aggression acts. Let's see how things keep on developing. First, let's add a recommendation. It's an article that we find in RT. It's called Interest, Interference, and Military Coup. And the question is, has there been a revolution in Sudan? And this is by a Spanish journalist, a specialist in the topic. And he says, when we're talking about the authors, let's answer the question. What he says is that in September 2018, Turkey signed an agreement of $100 million with Sudan, in which Ankara would invest in the exploration of petroleum. Additionally, they reached agreements in agriculture and farming matters.
Alcanzaron otros convenios en materia agrícola y de explotación granjera.
Erdogan, president of Turkey, who wanted to become the Sultan of the Arabic countries, wanted to put down Bashir. Turkey also agreed to build an airport of Khartoum. That was $1 billion. This is an opinion by the author Alberto Rodriguez. We'll keep on analyzing all of this information. Let's go to other details of the importance of this country. We're talking to our correspondent from El Congo, Oscar Epelde. Permanent solutions to Sudan have to recognize that the civil society have the right to govern the transition without any militaries. What's being said around the people is also in the African Union of suspending Sudan as a member country. Although what they're asking is that the authority of the transition be led by the civils. The people of the African Council has a near relationship with the military authority. And what they're trying to do is open roads to dialogue. Both countries want to have allies in the Sudan government. So the Western countries promote these dialogues between the civil society and the military committee. The expert committee of the United Nations said yesterday that the violent repression of the militaries against the opposition pushed the country towards an abysm of human rights, which reminds the military stance on when it justified the use of violence. Sudan confronts the challenge of finding a political system that integrates everybody. Although some countries keep beliefs on liberty and religion. However, in the process, the influence of the regional powers might be an impediment to reaching peace. In the Red Sea, there is disputes between Qatar and all of the resources that this country has, and other factors that show the real wealth of the country threaten finding any peace solution, which is so wanted by the people. Let's go back to Caracas. We ask ourselves if it's positive of the African Union of suspending Sudan as a member until there is not a civil committee for transition. So, according to all of the actions that's going on, where is this leading us? Is this revolution brought forth by the people, or is it just an independent military coup d'etat? We've got questions set, and let's go to a pause, and we'll be right back. We're back. Crisis in Sudan, military coup, foreign interference. Let's see some more information. After the after the exit of al-Bashir, after being 30 years in the power. After getting out Hassan al-Bashir in the April Revolution, the military council broke all the agreements with the civilians. Without the historical leader in front of the country, the military who took over the control announced a transition phase of 2 years, followed by elections. The government was left in a military council of transition in the hands of the chief military. However, this created rejection from the opposers, because what they said is that this military had strong ties to al-Bashir. That's why he quit one day after, taking over another general in front of this military council. Up until then, he had been in charge of the Sudanese troops. Al-Burhan announced the liberation of the prisoners, but he did not go through with what he said. He didn't want to give explanations to all of those who had been with al-Bashir. This brought new wave of protests. The opposition had agreements, had negotiations. Everything came to a stop when militaries went into a protest camp, and as a result of this, nearly 110 people died. So there were civil disobedience, asking for a civil government. What people did was not leave homes, and the streets were abandoned. After these violent facts, the military asked to start negotiations once more. Well, what we're trying to do is get key factors. So let's see, this came from April 16, when we started to analyze this. Let's do it with Francisco Contreras. He's a sociologist, historian. He's from Stockholm. And from Argentina, Wadi Calvo, he's an expert in the Middle East. Thank you very much for answering our calls. Francisco, let me start with you. Is this a revolution with the face of the people that just want to change in the way that politics is being carried out, in the way it's being governed after 30 years of al-Bashir? Or is it a coup that has nothing to do with the people of the streets? Well, there are different ways of understanding it. There's a legitimate protest on behalf of popular sectors. There was a great unrest due to the economic crisis and the participation of Sudan in the Yemen war. This unrest that began in December last year was used by a sector that is closer to the interests of Saudi Arabia and to the Arab Emirates. And there we have the person who was in charge of the intelligence agency. He was a man that was very close to Israel as well as to the CIA. So the change of April, when Bashir al-Assad was thrown out of power, was just a way to put a military council that's very close to the Arab Emirates and to the Sudan, into Saudi Arabia. And there's a group of interests that still have the power of Sudan. Let's ask Wadi, because there's a pressure of the militaries to stay in power after they threw out Bashir al-Assad. Was it just that the military took advantage of the civil unrest? Is there a military elite that depends on military and that doesn't understand any other way to govern? Yes, there's a lot of that. Many things have not changed. However, I think there's a breakdown in the military system of Sudan. Today there was an attempt of a coup d'etat, but not much information has been filtered. These are just small cracks that began in the power that al-Bashir has been created in the last 30 years. So this doesn't have any perspective of coming to an end. Thank you, Wadi. Let's go back to Francisco. There's an agreement right now to start negotiation and to stop aggressions on each side. And the militaries will liberate prisoners, and the opposition will not carry out aggressions. It's still to be seen if this agreement is so. However, there's a repression organism, and the people that's paying a high price in lives. I'm asking you, Francisco, do you think it's possible that this agreement be sustained? Well, I see it hard because the interests that are behind this military council of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, Arabian Emirates, what they're interested is in that Sudan keeps on participating in the war in Yemen, because like 1,000 soldiers are in Yemen, and they're not willing to popular unrest to take away their power. It's being said about a second Arab Spring. If there's a change of this military council, this could bring other popular unrests, any other protests. Egypt, which is very close and is also implicated in this alliance with Saudi Arabia, is also weak. So I think it's hard for the military council and the interests behind it let go of the power. There's other sectors and other actors that are intervening in this conflict. It's not just a conflict between the Sudanese and some international actors. Now it's spread to other actors, like the African Union, also the European Union has also added to the discussion, and the United States has a special envoy who participates in this conflict to try to mediate and find a solution. But I don't think that Saudi Arabia is willing to let go its power that at this moment has with the military in Sudan. Thank you, Francisco. Let's go back to Wadi. Is this positive? Do you think that it's positive that this pause on that has been imposed on by the African Union on Sudan, and United Nations has also sent people of their human rights? I think that it's very hard. If we take into account all of the resolutions that have been taken because of the Palestinian conflict with Israel, the threats of punishments against Israel, so many along the line, nothing has ever happened. Israel still has the power. And in the case of Sudan and the militaries, I think that everything's just written on air. So nothing will be attained further than the interest of the people in power. This is a very negative panorama. Let's go back to Francisco. He says that it's important to see that a conflict that goes beyond the borders and involves many actors in the region and outside that have a part in this. And there are many signals that give us clues. So, Francisco, tell us about the petromonarchies of the Gulf. Are they interested in being aligned with the transition government that is led by the military that resists to give up the power? Yes, there is a geopolitical conflict at this moment that confronts the Middle Eastern countries. On one side, you've got Turkey and Qatar, and on the other side, you've got Saudi Arabia and the Arab Emirates. And there you also see Egypt is integrated in this group, and that have led this conflict to. So al-Bashir was last year trying to get close to Turkey and Qatar. And maybe this was and there was a response of Saudi Arabia against. That's why they participated in April of the coup, of the military coup. So this conflict is there. Saudi Arabia participates actively. In fact, some days ago, there were some new generals in Egypt, and they got together with leaders of Saudi Arabia and Egypt. So this conflict is far beyond Sudan, and it has to do with several things, and not necessarily with the war of Yemen. One thing that's important is to control Sudan, because it's a huge territory, and it's got a lot of resources. So whoever controls Sudan also controls the Horn of Africa. So seeing over the actors, we see a geopolitical importance and the interest that each one has, the natural resources that are in this country. What do you think the decision of South Sudan has? Well, South Sudan is a great oil producer of which China takes advantage of. So here there's a factor that Francisco mentioned, is the intervention of other factors external from Africa. For example, in the whole region of Sahel, like countries like Chad, Niger, Mali, Mauritania, there is an influence on Israel. And as Israel is winning territory on the diplomatic space, more jihad and al-Qaeda groups are growing, and they're spreading to other countries where they had not existed, like Burkina Faso, Congo, and Mozambique. So with all of these elements, I think we have to broaden the objective. So it's not just a commercial war between China and the U.S. We have to analyze these small countries too. What's going to happen is totally uncertain. We'll be calling on you for more information further on. Let's analyze a little bit more of the geopolitical importance of this country. Well, let's see what are the interests of these regional actors, like the U.S. Some say that within the region, Saudi Arabia is one of the responsible for this crisis. And it's interesting that the U.S. sent an envoy to this territory. We're going to talk this with our next guest. Wait for us, we'll be right back. crisis in Sudan, military coup, interference. The fall of al-Bashir in April received the support of many countries, especially the allies of the U.S. Just as soon as Omar al-Bashir was thrown out, Saudi Arabia said he was going to support the military council as long as Sudan would keep their military forces in Yemen. Apparently, there were 14,000 military in Yemen. And he said that there were going to be $3 billion of investment to stabilize the country. Emirate Arabs was always going to support this country. Meanwhile, the Egyptian president offered to stabilize Sudan. In all of these months of repression, these countries have not said anything, have not done anything. It has been different what Ethiopia did. He arrived to Sudan to try to find solutions. However, until there is a civil military, the European Union and United Nations has condemned this country. International analysts say that behind all of this mobilization, behind al-Bashir, is Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Emirates. This has also involved China and Russia. In 2018, al-Bashir met with the Syrian president. Let's continue with our analysts. Luis León Paz. He's an expert on international affairs. Thank you very much for inviting me. Can we start by, can you identify where the causes for this crisis are? Well, in Sudan, we've got a very particular country because they've been independent from 1956. They had two great civil wars, a long history. Then in the year 2005, when there was an agreement, a peace agreement, there was supposed to be a permanent peace for the region of Sudan. However, it left some conflicts still awake. There's one of an autonomous region that has 50% of the oil. Some of these conflicts are still there. They're still awake, apart from the internal conflict. Apart from that, the peace agreement of 2005, there was a referendum that finally gave South Sudan independence. Obviously, this hinders the economy of Sudan because there's a great piece of 50% of the oil is in South Sudan. At the same moment, this has an impact on the GDP. And we also have to add some other effects of the sanctions, of the permanent, since 1997, that was imposed by the U.S. at a moment where they had been accused of fostering international terrorist groups. So there is a reduction in the income of the government. All of these sanctions that U.S. imposed, there has a repercussion on health. There's a report on the Council of the United Nations. And this also causes a consequence on infrastructure. There was no investment in the petroleum, which made the production fall in 20%. There was also an impact on the transportation infrastructure. So there's less transportation, not enough for the amount of people. Access to medicine, education, like more than 3 million kids have been affected that could not have access to education. So with all this panorama, this is what happens in Sudan right now. Because on one hand, the government has no money to invest in social sectors, and so they have to, at the same time, they have to take away all of the support to the agriculture. Obviously, there are actors. On one hand, you've got the military that have been governing for over 30 years. But yesterday, just recently, there was a coup d'état because there's been fractioning within the military. It's also important to say that the military is fundamental because there are 170,000 people in the military. Another thing is all of the people that are in Yemen, all of the military that are in Yemen. And they agreed to having them in Yemen. Another actor are the civil actors, political parties that are different in essence. So that contrasts with the military movement that is just uniform. So after 30 years of Bashar al-Assad, the militaries are used to having power, and they will not let it go easily. So when there is this negotiation with civil movements, with groups of teachers, of doctors, what they're seeking for is to have an intermediate point where they can assure the presence of the military within the new government, of this government of transition. So they want 7 civil people and 8 civil, 7 military. And this would ensure their presence. Could you explain that if the military is not willing to give up some positions of power to the opposition, how can negotiations keep on going? Well, of course, there's an advance in society. Once since the increase of the petroleum went up, there was a segment of the population that went up, and these are the ones that are now leading the popular uproar. But this goes in contrast with the military, who will not let go easily. And on the other hand, you've got the pressure of the African Union, because if after a while there are sanctions against Sudan, which they are totally entitled to, what it says is that the countries have the right to defend themselves. So this would imply that the military would have to dialogue with the civilians and give up some power, like what happened in Zimbabwe, where the powers were divided. And then we'll have to see, because there's a discourse of the military transition team that they say that the solution to the crisis will come, and that it will come eventually, but it just doesn't come. And on the other hand, you've got repression on the militaries like the one we had last week. So, of course, this is a radical wing that will not accept losing power. So you've got Saudi Arabia, Emirates, plus Egypt that supported the military committee. And they think that the change should not be so radical, but it should be a negotiated transition. But they admit that the military should be kept in the spectrum. What is Saudi Arabia? What is their interest? Well, on one hand, Sudan is one of the countries that is not so aligned with the countries of the Suez Canal, which is one of the main straits. That also implies that Saudi Arabia invests lots of money to sustain the military regime in Sudan. But there are also actors globally, like China and the U.S., because the government al-Bashir was the one who kicked out the U.S. companies from Sudan, and then is where China came in. This is one of the factors that have caused the internal crisis in Sudan. In fact, 3% of what is produced in South Sudan is purchased by China. However, it is in China's interest that everything is in peace, because they still want to keep on extracting petroleum from South Sudan. And on the other hand, they're trying to find ports and ways of exit to take out the petroleum without depending on North Sudan. And this is basically what the geopolitical game is. Another fundamental factor is the Nile. Because, of course, Ethiopia, who's being a mediator in the crisis, let's bear in mind that 98% of irrigation water of Egypt is due to the Nile. And Ethiopia has a dam that also give waters to South Sudan and Nile. Also, in the case of the Yemen war, Sudan was involved with Saudi Arabia in that war, and they were sanctioned by a group of countries. So there's a game there. Some people are very interested in what happens in Sudan because they're interested in keeping the military council. But at the same time, if that's not possible, then they would have to go to a civil government. Now that you mentioned Egypt, Emirates and Saudi Arabia, there's a famous author who said that the plans to repress the forces of Khartoum were rejected by the African Union. Well, Saudi Arabia is playing a fundamental role because they want Sudan as an ally with the war against Yemen, and at the same time to guarantee that the Suez Canal has a stable condition so they can export and import their goods from there. Washington, the United States, is trying to get even with what happened with Osama bin Laden. Yes, of course. There are things pending there. Although the U.S. Did not impose any more sanctions on Sudan, but all of the effect, all of the damage that has been done is still continuing. They've got a domination interest on all of the resources. From 1997, they've been accused of fostering and giving home to Osama bin Laden. And since then, all of the coercive sanctions were imposed. And up until today, they're not allowed to import spare parts, medical implementation. This affected the Sudan economy. And everything. What this is that they increase the price of living. And there's a vicious cycle that affects the civil society and cause this to be a country that's not governable. I ask about Turkey because in our recommendations to read of this article of Alberto Rodriguez, and other things, when they're talking about the actors, they remember that Turkey signed an agreement with Sudan where Ankara was going to invest in finding petroleum, and there were other agreements for agriculture and farming. So there are also interests there. Well, of course, they used to see over to Europe. But when Turkey saw that there was going to be an attack on them, they turned their eyes to Middle East, and now they're doing it more intensely. And there's agreement of modernization of the island of Suaki, and this will allow them to control the passing of oil through the Suez Canal. Obviously, Turkey is participating, but of course there's a contrast between them and Saudi Arabia, and this comes into to make the regional game more intricate. It appears that the most influential actor is Saudi Arabia. Speaking about the geopolitical, well, now we've seen the African Horn, very close to the Red Sea, which is the passage to the Suez Canal. And there's another important element, the case of al-Bashir. What's going to happen with him after all of this crisis? He's got the International Court is after him for genocide. Of course, all of this has to be determined. And also, well, the country can also judge him within their territory. So this is part of the negotiation between militaries and the civil powers or the civil society that are fighting for power in Sudan. So are we going to give Bashir al-Assad amnesty? What's going to happen with al-Bashir? This is still pending. And also another element is that why United States is sending a military veteran as a special envoy. Well, everybody's sending people. In fact, Russia has also sent an envoy to see how things are going, how to guarantee the investment that they will be doing in the upcoming years. All of the actors are waiting to see what's going on. What we see is that the military is armed with Russian weapons. In fact, al-Bashir said that thanked all the support of Russia. Obviously, all of this is still pending until we see who stays with the government power. If the government remains 50-50, 50% military and the other part civil, then there are some invasions that will continue. But once all of this situation has been overcome, things will be much better. Thank you very much, Luis, for all of your information. Let's go to our conclusions.
Si en algo coinciden nuestros analistas y investigadores es que
they agree is that what happens from here on is totally uncertain, and at the same time, the current events it tells us that there's a stop in the agreements. There's a military council of transition that has kicked out some of the people of Bashir al-Bashir, but things have not changed. Things are still the same. That's why the military do not allow a change for a civil government to come into seat. And on the other hand, we have got teachers and doctors and other professionals that are on the streets. In the negotiations, we would have to see how much the military is willing to give up the power. And on the actors, they've got many interests in the region and especially in the country. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, China, Russia, United States. So let's keep on seeing how this develops. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.